Hello, my loves. Hello, hello, hello. My name is Dustina. This is Spiritually Boujee Astrology, and we are going to do a meditative rant video. I'm specifically going to call this one Shooting from the Hip because y'all know I've been sick. I like to be a little bit more advanced in my stuff, and I like to put some stuff out like right as it's starting to become dominant or ahead of time so people can become prepared. But I gotta be honest, the one thing about having these retrogrades in my sixth house is as much as it's a health house, it's a work house, it's a routine house. Routine is not sticking. As soon as I start to get better, I'm trying to catch up. And then, of course, I had that second wave, as you guys know. And now I'm trying to catch up again. So, this right here is going to be a little bit of a different video where I'm going to reference some things, obviously, that are already going on because I'm already talking about those two retrogrades. But I also want to go ahead and put one thing out to kind of get us in that mental preparation mode of what we can start to expect when we get into what will be our new normal, which is going to be every day we wake up the second half of April and going into May. That there's something about once we get on the other side of all of this volatile, frustrating, retrograde, gauntlet, obstacle course vibration we've been in since last freaking summer, we got to get prepared for the ideas of what that new normal are going to be. Now, there's a couple things that are going on, and I'm going to reference them, but I'm not going to fully describe every single element. But I want to go over some of my notes that I started preparing for a Venus retrograde video to do back in February that I obviously didn't do in February because I had the flu. And I want to go ahead and put some things together because what I was putting together was not just about Venus retrograde. I'm going to describe some things about her. Not going to get too heavy on the Mercury part per se. There's going to be references to it, but not heavy on it. But a lot of this, I want to get more focused on what we can start to look for when Neptune goes into Aries. Now, this is not going to be a full Neptune and Aries video. It's more going back off of historic patterns that I found that can include Saturn, that can include Neptune. And whenever I get to the final little chapter of this, it's going to be a bit of a doozy because of how closely related it is. And I want to make everybody clear. There's no specific dates to this. This is more informational. This is literally something you can put it on the screen or listen to it audibly and just listen and walk around the house like I'm not doing a whole bunch of charts. I want to go off to what I found in my historical studies. I will link in the description some other YouTube content that I have found that actually like helps emphasize some additional stories to what I'm going to talk about, not stuff that I have created. And there will be a couple of Wikipedia links in there, but really it's just coming down to I want to go over what I found in the historical references. And if intuition takes over at any part and wants to tell everybody something, then I'm going to go over that too. But if it's an intuitive grab, I will say, oh, wow, that was all intuition and let you know afterwards. Okay. So this is not a normal video. If you don't like the meditative rant videos, that is okay. I haven't done one in a couple weeks because, again, I have been sick. You guys know that. I haven't sugarcoated. I've been as real as possible. You guys know I try to be the most authentic that I possibly can be because there's so many people that they get real cutesy, artsy, lovey-dovey, and I will not promise you sunshine and rainbows just to give you a bag of Skittles. I'm going to tell you it's Skittles. I won't tell you. At least I get the wild berry, though. Sometimes it's sour. But anyways, we're going to move on. Okay. So when it comes to a Venus retrograde, I just want to describe this one part first. Venus retrograde tends to follow a star pattern, and every 8 years she will go retrograde in the same sign as she did before, but it's roughly 1.5 to 2.5 degrees away from her previous point. For example, Venus turned retrograde on March 1st at 10 degrees. I don't care about the minutes. I'm just going to say 10 degrees for this part. It's like 10.5. That's why I'm saying it this way. Of Aries, but the last time she turned retrograde was right around the 13 mark. So this is why I'm saying like there's a half in there that's not a perfect 2 degrees. And she moves each time. And over the course of a century, She'll even move from another sign. That part's important because of one of the stories I'm going to talk about at closer to the end that has the most connections to this one, to this Venus retrograde. Okay. Now, you guys heard what I said when the fact that she goes retrograde in the same place every 8 years. And I would normally say, like, hey, if there's a historical pattern from this previous timeline, go back and look at your pictures, look at your text messages, look at whatever you got, social media from that time frame, and see what connections you can make. I did not do that for this Venus retrograde because we would have been comparing 2025 to 2018, looking for examples. 2018, 2017, sorry. No. When I looked at the comparison, the outer planets were in such different areas to where they are now. My gut told me we wouldn't necessarily see like a full like repeat of a certain timeline. We were not going to see a full repeat of what happened then. We might see some similarities, especially the health stuff, Venus retrograde and her detriment. There could be the health stuff that would be similar, but there wasn't enough of the outer planets to make me believe that we would be a full on, absolutely, we're going to see something that's the same. So what I started to look for in specific was Venus retrogrades where both Saturn and Neptune were aspected. That is not easy to find. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because Saturn spends anywhere between 2.5 to 3 years to go through a single sign. Neptune can take anywhere between like 12 to 20 years to go through a sign because of how elliptical his orbit is. Some signs last longer than others, very similar to Pluto, except for Pluto being further out, he takes even further to go around. So we're going to have some similarities of some things that we're going to talk about. But for me to actually find those connections, sometimes I have to jump a decade or 2 or 20. Little foreshadowing there. Okay. It's not 20, but it's exaggerant, that's for sure. I have to jump around a lot. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go backwards. And I'm going to talk about where I found some similarities. And I will tell where the similarities are. Like it's more like these planets are involved, but I'm also going to say where they're different. But what you'll start to see is some of the same themes, even in those Venus retrogrades, where again, Saturn and Neptune were both involved somehow. To now, you'll hear similar words, similar themes, similar aspects, similar things that are going on. And that goes into the emphasis that, again, when certain transits are happening, history can repeat itself. And as I continue to go through some of these timelines, you will hear the similarities. So just preparing you for that. Now, the main reason I want to look at the similarities is because history does repeat itself. And whenever we do not learn from our mistakes, we do not pay attention to history, the good can repeat and the bad can repeat. And there's so much of what's going on right now that we're trying to unravel past rules, past laws. We're trying to unravel past decisions, whether you're for them, against them. I don't care. It's not about that. That there's obviously something that either the unraveling is necessary. This is why I'm saying I don't care about it. Or we're ready to make the same mistakes from before in some way. That's a little harder to think about, but it is the truth. If we unravel all of the good, all of the structure, all of the laws, all of the rules, all the things that have been done to build us to the point that we have been, there's going to be harsh realities. Some can be positive, others can be negative. And the one thing that I will say that whenever I went through all of these different timelines that I thought were so crazy was how often tariffs or a part of the conversation, especially in the first 120 years, 140, I should say 140 years of the United States. And there's certain references that are going to go back to that also. So I want to put some things together, kind of talk about them. I'm going to potentially jump around a little bit depending, because my notes are kind of crazy with how I wrote them. I'm just being honest. Y'all know me. I'm old school. This is a notebook, and you can see like I had to go back in my notes to get to this point. I was prepared to do this way sooner than I'm doing it right now. So again, I apologize. But a lot of the concept is not focused so much on Venus retrogrades, but it feels like Venus and Neptune. And when their octaves get mixed together, their energies get mixed together, we get the same topics that we're dealing with right now. And that I could not ignore. So let's start to go backwards. We're not going to go back to 2017. We're going to go a little bit further than that. The first one I want to talk about is 2007. And in 2007, we had a Venus retrograde that was in Leo. That particular Venus retrograde was making conjunctions to Saturn, but 2007 and 8 were 2006, 7, 8. We got to get the full spectrum there. Were the years that Neptune was in Aquarius, and by sign, by whole house, Saturn going through Leo was making oppositions to Neptune. Now, in 2007, we started to deal with the financial crisis towards the housing market. Yeah, that was a big part of that. And I started to look at some of the themes of what was going on in 2007 and connect them to now. During that Venus retrograde in Leo, the return of the Pakistan prime minister had happened. Now, I'm bringing this up for a reason because I thought it was interesting. When I looked backwards to see when he was removed during the 1999 Venus retrograde in Leo. So we have the return of a world leader, not our world leader. I know most of the people that listen to me, you're either in Canada or America. I get that. But there was still the return of a world leader. And I've seen that happen actually before, where one leader gets removed during a retrograde, they're gone for a while, and either through an eclipse axis coming back around or the next retrograde pattern, specifically Venus's retrograde, that person coming back around or having the next chapter of their life happen. So that was a really interesting thing. It wasn't necessarily the Americas, but we're going to get to that part next. In the summer, specifically on August 31st of 2007, President Bush ordered for the loan modification programs to start after the first wave of the housing collapse started to hit in 2007. Now, most of us think 2008. That was when the housing collapse happened. That was whenever it hit its peak of finalizing. But all of 2007, we were going through the housing collapse, and people tend to forget that. And he tried to create the first loan modification programs to help people stay in their homes. But because that last year was just loaded with the financial crisis, people don't necessarily remember that he tried to do corrective actions. He tried to help. That was also a presidential election year where we had people running, to become president. And of course, in 2008, we got President Obama. So there was the systematic collapse that came through. And it was a very interesting time of like Saturn in its detriment, Saturn in Leo, hitting this opposition of Neptune, which was the illusion of the loan programs that people had been using. And I want to say the illusion, like I'm very specific to saying the illusion now. That loan programs, they were calling them ninja loans all through the early 2000s. Like people would just make up numbers, not even put their social security down. There were loans out in the names of dogs. If you've ever seen the movie The Big Short, they literally reference that. Like there's one scene where the guy goes up, knocks on the door of a house in Florida, asks for the name of the person that's supposed to be the owner, and literally the tenant goes, "You want my landlord's dog?" Like, they didn't care. And that lies, the fraud, the deception, that's why I reference that with Neptune so often, had a reality check, and Saturn in the opposition saying it: time, rules, karma, boundaries, laws, governance. A certain governance needed to come into power and come into light based off of the illusion, the lies that had been going on in society. Neptune in Aquarius. Now, whenever it came to the Saturn element in that opposition to Neptune, that Venus retrograde coming through, it was a support idea of like, we need to modify, we need to create another program, we need to do something to try to help these people stay in their homes, because we didn't know the full extent of how bad that loan programs had been, all the loans that had been written. We didn't know what we didn't know. And we ended up discovering that more in 2008. In the parts of 2008 and 2009, when Saturn moved into Virgo, Saturn made oppositions to Uranus. This isn't going off of the retrograde, but it's stuff that I've studied before. And it was like when Saturn hit the opposition to Uranus, Uranus and Neptune were in mutual reception. Uranus was in Neptune's sign. Neptune was in Uranus's sign. Neptune was in Aquarius, Uranus in Pisces. There was something about like the awakening, the understanding, the shocks of information, of learning what we didn't know. And it had a ripple effect of whole new laws, Saturn in Virgo, that came into play to change literally the whole housing market, the lending market around housing, and everything over the course of those few years. Now, obviously, Saturn in Virgo has nothing to do with the Venus retrograde part, but there was still like collective energies that kind of spoke to that. But a lot of it still started in that 2008 time frame or 2007 time frame. And that particular Venus retrograde was meant to support the Saturnian. It was meant to support the new laws, the new procedure, the new boundaries. As things were coming to light, we were trying to find solutions. That Venus retrograde was an attempt at solutions. It didn't necessarily work the way that we wanted. There was a couple years of a ripple effect as to like learning what we didn't know before. And it completely revamped the housing market. I think that's really interesting to think about, because whenever we think of houses, we don't necessarily think of Virgo, Leo, Aquarius, or Pisces. We don't. We usually associate it with Cancer. But whenever it comes to the ways that we buy homes, the rules, the procedure, the process, that would be associated with Virgo. And I think I'm cluing that into that part. So intuition just took over. Because again, and I've talked about this once before, South Node in Virgo, rules, process, procedure, they're going to change. Another thing about Virgo and the changes of that is like changes towards labor. And that's going to make more reference to another decade I'm going to talk about. But I can see different parts of the similarities. And because different planets or different luminaries, whenever we're talking about the nodes, are involved, it also shows me why this one would be different compared to whenever Saturn was there before. Okay. I'm going to stop that. No more 2007. We're going to keep going. In 1998, this one made me giggle. This one made me giggle so much when I was doing this one. We had a Venus retrograde that was split between Aquarius and Capricorn. And what's similar about that particular Venus retrograde was the conjunctions to Neptune. In my mind, I'm thinking Neptune was in Capricorn. That's Saturn's sign. So we're going to have similarities. Okay. That particular Venus retrograde also coincided with Neptune changing signs, just like now. Neptune was going from Capricorn to Aquarius. This was the first year of Neptune going into Aquarius. And Venus went into Aquarius, Venus made a conjunction to Neptune in Capricorn, went into Aquarius, turned retrograde, came back, made another conjunction to Neptune, goes backwards even more, turns direct. And then her third and final hit was Neptune in Aquarius. So Neptune changed signs during this particular Venus retrograde. And I went back looking for the headlines. And now we're going to find another theme per se, but very, very different for a multitude of reasons. The top name in the headlines in January of 1998 was President Clinton because he was being impeached. They actually filed for his impeachment in January of 1998. They were trying to get him impeached. Why? Because he lied. Neptune. Neptune, there it is. There's that fraud, deception stuff. Neptune, what did he lie about? He lied about an affair. He lied about having a fling with an intern. He lied about his abuse of power, that's for sure. Again, Neptune in those final degrees of Capricorn. He lied. And as the truth was coming to light, and everybody was learning about it, again, Neptune going into Aquarius, so the people, the masses, and everything else, people in positions of power lying and that now becoming known, there was an attempt to get a president out of office. Now, obviously, it wasn't successful. He finished his term out. But that entire Venus retrograde, the top name in the headline was a president. And that's where my similarities are. Because what are we doing right now? We're doing a Venus retrograde. Venus retrograde, where the top name in the headlines, President Trump. Whether you're for him or against him, it's not about that right now. We are looking at the similarities and the patterns. I'm going to keep this going. That's what that one just made me giggle because obviously it was really for very, very different reasons. But again, we're looking for patterns. Okay. Now, we're going to go back even further. We want to go now to 1990. We had a Venus retrograde again between Aquarius and Capricorn. And that particular Venus retrograde ended in a conjunction to Saturn. And what's interesting, and you're going to see this pattern real quick. The Communist Reform Party released, so Saturn, that particular Venus retrograde, there was two conjunctions. One was long term. And that's kind of where we're going to be at the end of this Venus retrograde, just to be clear. Venus had a direct hit, went all the way into Aquarius, turned retrograde, came back, and basically was spinning on top of Saturn direct that whole time, and ended her retrograde. At the end of this one that we're in, that's basically what Venus is going to do, is she's going to end her retrograde very, very tightly close to Saturn. They're going to be less than a degree and a half, like less than 2 degrees apart. So there's going to be something theme-wise that we're going to see a similarity to in regards to not necessarily the Communist Party or Russia per se, but a change in authority. And that's where I want to go with this one. At the end of the 1990 Venus retrograde, the Communist Party reformed, and it actually released its first countries to let them leave the USSR. And as soon as that happened, Romania banned communism. So I thought that was interesting because of the political aspect with Saturn there. Obviously, that timeline would have been Saturn and Capricorn because of how far back we're talking. So it was Saturn in its own sign. But you got to think USSR, Russia, made an active decision to release its own acquired, however you want to believe it. I don't care. It's not about that. I'm just trying to make this as neutral as possible, guys. Acquired countries. And that's whenever those first countries were actually released from the Soviet Union. And we started that development and that switchover from Soviet Russia to Russia as we know it now, as well as those neighboring countries getting released and becoming independent in their own area. That includes Ukraine, guys. There's your commonality. Whenever we have certain Venus retrogrades that have hit conjunctions to Saturn, we have major hits that we see that tie to the government. We've seen it whenever I talked about the 2007, 2008 timeframe of, the government trying to make policy changes all of a sudden, trying to use its power to overcome a situation. But Saturn was opposite Neptune. It didn't know what it didn't know yet. Whenever we talk about this combination of what happened in 1990, Saturn was in his own home sign, so not in his detriment, in its own most righteous power, making a decision to reform and release and do something different. And that Venus retrograde, again, offered some level of solution based off of its ending. Okay. There was one commonality there. Now we're going to jump back a lot further. We're going to go to 1970. This one's going to be a little bit different. This particular Venus retrograde was completely in Scorpio. It did not make conjunctions to Saturn. It did not make conjunctions to Neptune. However, it is the end of the Venus retrograde, kind of like what I just talked about in the 1991, that I thought was very interesting, because there's one particular word that was created in the 1970s that I had not heard since I was in college, so I'd actually kind of forgot about it, that I've now been hearing all the time on the news. Now, y'all know me. If it's not my local news, I've said this plenty of times before, I don't watch CNN, Fox News, I don't watch any of that crap. I watch Bloomberg. I like to watch Bloomberg because at the end of whatever policy change or whatever, they don't go off of like their belief systems. They don't start to get super opinionated. They go, numbers. What is this doing to the market? Numbers don't lie. I like numbers. I like numbers. I like statistics. It's weird, I know. But the impact of certain things always have a numerical measurement too. Now, the 1970 Venus retrograde was completely in Scorpio. It did not make a conjunction to Neptune, but it was co-present with Neptune. The entire retrograde, Neptune is at 27, 28, and 29 degrees of Scorpio. It moved into Sagittarius the very day that Venus turned direct, like quite literally. Venus turned direct, Neptune moved into Sag. Neptune moved into a fire sign. There's another one of our little correspondence there. Neptune moved into a fire sign, and we went into a decade known as stagflation. All right, I'm going to read this to you. According to the Googles, stagflation is a term that describes a situation where the economy experiences both high inflation and slow economic growth, often accompanied with high unemployment. Stagflation. I have watched Bloomberg for years. You guys have heard me talk about it before. If you've listened to me since the very beginning, you know, like this is it. It's on my TV on mute right now. Sometimes while reading the headlines just as I'm talking. Stagflation. It was created in the 70s. And what started to happen in the 70s is like we had major inflation things that were happening, but there was no true growth in the economy. In fact, in certain situations and certain industries, it's like one industry would grow, the other one would fall back, another one would grow, another one would fall back. So we never had something truly centered on growth. And it was a term that literally encapsulated the entire 1970s. And it started the day Neptune went into Sagittarius, which was also the end of a Venus retrograde. Now, I again have not really heard that term since I was in college, but I have heard it nonstop on Bloomberg the last few months, specifically since Venus went into Aries. Now, one other commonality that we just talked about is that Venus retrograde was in Scorpio. That was a Venus retrograde in a Mars ruled sign. Neptune had been in a Mars ruled sign, but then it moved into a fire sign. Now we're going to go into Neptune moving into a Mars ruled fire sign. Now, you guys already know one of the things that happened historically the last time Neptune was in Aries, because I've already talked about it. That was the start of the Civil War. And I've already talked about we have markers for revolution. I'm not going to get too stuck on that again. I'm not trying to get stuck on it now. But I am looking for commonalities. And again, I'm looking for patterns. Neptune in a fire sign was accompanied with the concept of stagflation. We're about to go into that again. And before we even get into the full elements of Neptune in this fire sign, we are already hearing the term, we are already seeing the markers. And I have firmly believed that all of the Aries eclipses, this Venus retrograde, this Mercury retrograde, this 7-layered shit show that we're in is like the universe preparing for Neptune and Aries. And I'll talk more about that whenever we get to the close, because I want to give some ideas of some of the things that I'm expecting, but I don't want to get stuck on that quite yet. Now, a couple other things that I thought was interesting was major headlines during that 1970 Venus retrograde was nuclear effects, nuclear power, and how it was a dominant part of the headline. It has also been a dominant part of the headlines, at least in business news, because they're looking for alternative powers. And a lot of the people in power right now aren't really sold on solar. So it's like where they're trying to revert back to an old concept, and they're trying to revert. I cannot even use that word now. Revert back to nuclear. Now, I'm not completely opposed to that. I'm going to give one little opinion, because I've also watched where we've had advances in science. And I think that if we stay on top of our protocols, nuclear can work. But that also means making sure that regulations are followed. We need regulations. Rules are followed. Safety precautions are followed, because we do not want another version of Chernobyl. So there's that. And as long as we're doing efforts to learn from our mistakes, I'm not completely opposed to the idea of nuclear. I can see the benefits, but we're not going to get on all that. But I thought that was interesting. One of the major headlines that was going on in that particular Venus retrograde was nuclear effects. And then also Canada. There you go. Canada invoked a wartime response, a wartime measure act, for the only time in history when Canada was not at war. And that particular Venus retrograde accompanied a timeline for the country of Canada known as the October Crisis. Now, I did not have a whole lot of time to actually deep dive into October Crisis. That wasn't something that really spoke to me to just kind of deep dive into. However, I know I have Canadians for clients and listeners. So anything that you guys know about the October Crisis, definitely put the links in the comments, because I will happily go watch or read whatever it is. I just not, whenever I found that, I thought it was interesting, because again, Canada felt the need in a non-war time to invoke war acts. And considering one of the other top headlines that we're dealing with right now in this Venus retrograde has to do with Canada for different reasons, still the same country, I thought that was interesting. Okay. Now it's more based off economy stuff, I know, but I thought it was interesting that that was also something that happened during a Venus retrograde. Okay, now we're going to go way, way, way far back. And if you've listened to me for a long time, specifically last year, right before we went into the Mars retrograde, the timeline I am about to reference, we've talked about before. We've talked about already, but for a whole different reason, specifically the Mars retrograde. 1881. What? Dusty? It's a long ass time ago. I know. 1881. Now, the reason we talked about 1881 was because the last half of that year the last few months, we had a Mars retrograde in Cancer, just like we had. And I, in a previous episode, talked about like some of those elements, and I specifically like referenced a Netflix documentary, docudrama kind of thing that goes back to like Wyatt Earp in that timeline because of the correspondence of a Mars retrograde that happened in the second half of that year. However, in the earlier part of that year of 1881, there's another common historical reference. And I thought my mind was blown because of how similar it was. Now, I am going to post some YouTube links for other creators. I already said that in the beginning. This is the reason why. Because I want you guys to hear it, whoever wants to hear. If you don't want to hear, you don't have to listen. I don't care. It's not about that. It's more along the lines of when I heard this historical documentary thing that was done by another content creator, when I heard certain sentences being used from back then, knowing that they have been getting used now, history definitely repeats itself, and it's crazy to me. So, what is it about 1881 that is so amusing? James Garfield, President Garfield, his first 100 days in office included a Venus retrograde. Now, I want to talk about the similarities, and I will even show the similarities. So I'm going to show a chart for those that are listening in the audio only, but it's more just because my mind was boggled by how close this was. For me to find a Venus retrograde, number one, that also made conjunctions to Neptune and made conjunctions to Saturn simultaneously, I had to go back a long ways. And a Mercury retrograde and the nodes in a Jupiter Mercury ruled sign. Now, what's going to be different is the North Node was in Sag, South Node was in Gemini, but it's still South Node in a Mercury ruled sign, North Node in a Jupiter ruled sign, just like now. Now, Neptune is not about to change signs. Saturn is not about to change signs. So there's going to be some differences. But there was a lot of similarities from this timeline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show part of the chart. I'm just showing this like one day. I'm not going to go through the entire chart. This is April 18th of 1881. Venus was retrograde. You can see that right here. Neptune, Saturn, right in this same time frame. Venus will be making conjunctions to both of those. I was mistaken. Mercury wasn't retrograde the entire time. Mercury it followed a Mercury retrograde. So there was the correspondence, and it wasn't even in the same sign. So I apologize. But here's what happened. Here's the history of why I was just dumbfounded. So Garfield was not the initial first choice to run for president in the end of 1980. In fact, the Republican Party was very split. Ulysses S. Grant was looking at the idea of running again, but not all the Republicans would get behind him. He was too forceful. And then the more liberal side of the Republicans, they had a candidate that not everybody would get behind. So the thing about James Garfield, President Garfield, was that he was in the middle. He didn't ruffle anybody's feathers. So both sides of the Republican Party would get behind him. And he won quite well. How he won and the platform that he ran on, and this is why I'm putting the links in the description so you guys can go hear it yourself, is he wanted to drain the swamp. That's what he ran on. He wanted to make major policy changes in his first 100 days. Sound familiar? Okay. To drain the swamp and change economic policies. That sounds real familiar. Now, the thing about James Garfield is he is considered the president that never was. Because after his first 100 days in office, right as Venus was leaving shadow. Okay. There was an attempt on his life. July 2nd of 1881. Someone from his own party felt like he didn't get his fair share of uppance of support for supporting the president during his presidential run. He wanted to become an ambassador. He thought that he had given all these grand speeches, I think it was in New York, to sway people to vote for Garfield. But Garfield's like Mariah Carey in this aspect. He was like, I don't know you. He didn't remember him. He didn't see the speeches that this guy had made in the same light as the guy. The guy felt slighted. So, and this was back before we felt the need for, the Secret Service, by the way. The president would just walk around like a normal person. He wasn't completely guarded. There was no need, especially in a non-wartime, to have protection for the president until this event. And one of his own party shot James Garfield while he was out. Now, the thing about this assassination attempt is it didn't immediately kill President Garfield. In fact, it wasn't until much, much later that he did die, and that was September 19th, 2.5 months after the assassination attempt. It wasn't truly the bullet that killed him. It was the doctors not cleaning their hands and creating an infection inside the president. And that's how he passed. However, he was very successful in his first 100 days of major economic policy changes, so much to the fact that members of his own party felt alienated because he did exactly what he said he was going to do. Even though not everybody liked it, he went in, he signed a bunch of executive orders, he passed a bunch of laws through Congress, he did a bunch of major changes, super, super fast, ruffled everybody's feathers to drain the swamp. That's real. That happened. And when I first heard that was his running line that he was doing, I was floored. And it was because I was going through one of my history nights of like listening to stuff from the past, because that keeps my emotions in check sometimes. I don't seem to be as emotionally activated. That's when I went looking for what was going on during that time. I actually looked at this completely separate from what we're doing right now. So whenever I first looked into this, it wasn't even during like this springtime of doing my research. No, it was way further back. I found it by accident over a year ago, and it stayed in my head because I knew we were coming up on it. And whenever I heard that during the swamp thing, I'm like, that's going to be really interesting, because whenever President Trump goes into office, that first 100 days, we're going to have a Venus retrograde, not the same sign, obviously, making multiple conjunctions to Neptune and Saturn in a sign. He made changes that had a long-term effect. Now, after he passed, his vice president was worthless. Everybody knows it. He didn't want to be president. He was specifically chosen, by the way, to be vice president because President Garfield did not want someone undercutting him or trying to remove him from office. He wanted someone just to be a placeholder VP. That's what Chester Arthur was supposed to be. But then he got thrusted into the presidential seat after this assassination, and he didn't know what to do. I hope that's not foreshadowing at all. I really do hope that's not foreshadowing at all. But I thought it was super interesting because of how similar that was. a president in his first 100 days coming into office to completely change the economics, foreign policy, current policies that are going on, to drain the swamp and make huge changes just to have someone else from his own party hate his guts for it. And it wasn't even for the policies that he was changing. It was because that guy felt slighted and disrespected. That's very interesting to me. And one of the main things that they were also changing were tariffs. When I did a lot of my research for Venus retrogrades conjunct Neptune, it was very common in the first 140 years of this country to change tariffs, to change the imports. But the major difference from then to now was America built things. We were a production-based country. We had assembly lines. Ford Motor and everything that it was doing in Detroit, like the first years of Detroit was completely encapsulated and molded around Ford Motor Company. There were so many other industries out there that they completely engulfed and made the city. I'm from a small town called Bartlesville, Oklahoma. I don't live there anymore, so I have no problem saying that. It was an oil town. Phillips 66, based out of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And whenever oil crashed and stuff like that, that town could also crash. It was completely built around the Phillips family. Even to the point that the hospital is named after the wife. The main hospital in that town is named Jane Phillips Hospital Memorial Center. And Jane Phillips was named after the wife of Frank Phillips, the guy that started Phillips 66. Now it's not even called Phillips 66. It's called ConocoPhillips. But what we grew up knowing was Phillips 66. Most of us. Anyone that was born in the 1900s, you know what I'm talking about. Phillips 66. I'm from a small town that had that same type of mentality, that the entire town was branded and framed around this company that was basically creating all of the jobs and funding all of the jobs. The first 200 years, we were a country that actually built things. And that's the main difference compared to now. Because if they were tariffing something back then, they were tariffing certain imports like coffee, sugar. But we were also coexistent with the fact that we created tobacco and we had our exports of what we were creating and sending out. We don't do that the same way. Now, intuition's kind of taking over. I can feel it. One of the things that I started to see over the last 2 years in my meditation is that new industries have to happen. And I'm going to kind of reference that revolution marker that I talked about once before about Neptune going into Aries, because the first thing that happened when Neptune went into Aries was, yes, the Civil War. But then by the time we went into the end of the Civil War, that was a Saturn-Neptune opposition, where Saturn was in Libra hitting oppositions to Neptune right by the end of the war. And that's when the Civil War ended. And considering that was Saturn in its exaltation, Saturn in Libra in the 1860s that I'm talking about, that was a very well-placed Saturn, willing to be more fair, create better laws, redraw certain boundaries, and to unify the nation. Now it's a little bit different. Saturn is going to go into Aries, and Saturn in Aries is said to be in his fall. It's not well placed. We tend to see volatile, violent patterns, specifically with government, when Saturn goes into Aries. Now, we did this in the 1990s, but luckily we had President Clinton in office. But in the 90s, we had Desert Storm. That was more early 90s, but still, that was there. What I actually think about is the time before that, and that was the 1960s when Saturn went into Aries. And right before Saturn went into Aries, it was Saturn in Pisces making oppositions to Uranus and Pluto. And some of you guys know this. This is your natal placement that I'm talking about, because I have a lot of clients that you guys were born in the 1960s. You have that Uranus Pluto in Virgo, and you're either that 1966, 67, where your Saturn is in Pisces, or you're the 1968, 69 babies where your Saturn is in Aries. The last time, that particular time with Saturn in Aries, we were going through the, not the Korean, Vietnam. We were going through Vietnam. And for anyone that knows history, we didn't need to be in Vietnam. The story that they used to put us into that situation was later discovered to be false. But there is something, and this is also going to tie back to the Venus retrogrades and the Neptune stuff all the way around, I promise you. There is something that we learned in the 1900s that we didn't understand as much in the 1800s. And this is going to take me back to a whole different timeline, but we still are going to be talking about a Venus retrograde conjunct Neptune when I describe this next. So, in 1908 and 1916, there were Venus retrogrades in the sign of Cancer. 1908, we had specific things going on with tariffs, and that particular Venus retrograde again was making multiple conjunctions to Neptune. I don't really want to get too heavy on that one, but whenever we got into 1916, there was something very different going on in the world that quite literally was able to change certain certain outlooks in regards to ways the US could make money. And I look at the two of them because Neptune was still really, really close. It wasn't quite Venus retrograde hitting both Saturn and Neptune. It was more like 1908. I saw a certain pattern that switched by 1916. And I know what it was, and I'm going to be making some roundabout things as to what I describe right now. That, again, I think is playing into where we're going next in society. So in 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt, was the one in office, and he had made a big mistake the year before. And he had actually stated that he wasn't going to run for election again. Now, at that time, there was not a term limit on presidents. So it was common for a president to try to run for a third term. However, there's only one president that ever had more than 2 terms, and that was FDR. So not Teddy Roosevelt, the one that we're about to talk about, but the other Roosevelt. Now, not really worried about him. It's not about that. Now, one of the things about when Teddy Roosevelt nominated someone to run in his place, because he didn't feel like he could backtrack on his words, he specifically tried to find a president that was going, or a nominee, I should say it that way, that was going to protect the rules and policies he had already placed. Now, he was real specific in regards to what he talked about in his policies, and that was, you walk softly, but you carry a big stick. You don't necessarily go pushing on people's buttons, but you are always prepared to defend yourself. That's really what that comment means. And he wanted to find someone that was not going to ruffle the feathers and ruffle the policies, mess up the policies that he had already created. Problem is, the nominee that he put into place did exactly that, and we did a massive change in tariffs. Again, a lot of times when I find Venus retrograde very, very close to Neptune, I find these big policy tariff changes. But then over the course of one Venus retrograde in Cancer to the next one, Venus retrograde, was very closely conjuncted to Saturn, made multiple conjunctions to Saturn, and still relatively close to Neptune, but not exactly conjuncting it. And this is where our policy changes really switched up. Now, one of the things that happened in the early 1900s, and I'm not going to go specific on age dates right here, it's just something that I know, and intuition's kind of taking over again. There were multiple times that the US government had to get bailed out, and they couldn't necessarily go to another country to get a bailout. They actually had to go to their own millionaires that had been created. And 9 times out of 10, they would go to JP Morgan, the JP Morgan. Okay. Mr. Pierpont himself. And Pierpont would be the ones that actually gets the other guys going, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and everything else. They put a pool of money together and they would bail out the US government. Happened twice. And one of the reasons that it happened the first time was because they weren't making enough money off of tariffs. That's not a joke. That's real. The second time the money got all pulled up together was to bail out the banking system. And that specifically happened in that 1908 timeframe. And I thought that was really interesting. That's why I kind of referenced that, because we have a lot of banking policies that are about to change. And there's something about JP Morgan that I keep going back to. I keep researching this guy because I'm trying to find the connections from him to now. Because there's something about his policies and the things that he required. Like, he started to put regulations out there. A lot of the banks did not actually keep their funds in the banks. Like, they didn't keep the notes there to be able to service the withdrawals. And that's one of the reasons why that second go round was necessary for JP Morgan. But then something changed in the 1916 timeframe. And it really taught the US government a new lesson. And that was World War I. Now, the thing about World War I is the US economy had a huge boom in World War I. And that was right as, again, Neptune started to go into Leo. Neptune in a fire sign, by the way. Okay. You guys know me. All right. That particular Venus retrograde being so tightly conjunct Saturn, when that timeline of presidential elections happened, they realized that they did not have to run on office on the idea of changing tariffs. They were actually able to run their office. And I mean, run like people running for president were able to run off the idea of war bonds, because once the country was the most dominant production country out there, exports went through the roof. Our exports went through the roof. And it's what led into like the booming 20s and all of the flapper girls and the gaudy stuff that we think about, the gold and the deco and everything from the 20s. That came from the money that was made after World War I, because we were the top producer and there wasn't a need to default back into tariffs. But what the country learned is they could make a lot of money in war. That's what I think is interesting, because I feel like as a whole, and that was Neptune going into Leo, by the way, which was followed by Saturn in Leo. As a whole, we are definitely seeing an energy that seems to be instigating fights, instigating change, yes, but instigating fights. I can see a lot of like little things from all these different timelines. I'm like, that's familiar, that's familiar, that's familiar. And each time we're talking about very certain planets being in the same players. Different places, obviously. We're at a different age, so we've had some levels of growth, but a lot of differences too. And then it puts me into what I keep seeing with the next phase of what we're going into. And that is Neptune going back into Aries. Now, I've kind of referenced this a little bit already, talking about first the Civil War. But what happened after the Civil War? We went into the Reconstruction era, and the South was rebuilt. And that led into a huge economic boom because all of these internal states were able to grow businesses. Now, they had to change. There had to be a change, and most specifically, a labor change. Now, I'm going to make some connections, and some of the words I'm about to use are not going to make some people happy. I cannot help that. But I want to correspond history to what we're doing now. Try to stay neutral. I know somebody's going to have an opinion. That's why that's why I preface so much of what I say next. During the first part of Neptune in Aries, Saturn was in Virgo. Right now we have the South Node in Virgo. There's a part of the correspondence. And the whole thing about the Civil War really and truly came down to one half of the country believed that they should be able to own slaves and the other half didn't. And that's where the Civil War came from. And it really came down to do with human rights, civil rights, and whether certain people were allowed to be people or not. And I'm saying this as a Native American. I know the Irish won and everybody sees this part. I know that, but I'm a Delaware, which is a Lenape. And whenever it comes to where the river tribes that my people come from, that land doesn't even exist anymore because you literally go to the land of Delaware, you're not going to find a whole bunch of like native things. One of the things I do love about living in Oklahoma is how much respect it has for the tribes and for natives. Now, there was a lot of things around natives. There was a lot of things around slaves and African Americans and indentured servants and just so much that we can go back to. And I don't want to get into all that. What I'm going to dumb it down to is we had to do a change in labor. And that sticks me to the Virgo topic. During the Civil War, the first part of it, Saturn again was in Virgo. It did not end until Saturn moved into Libra. Sticking with that part. The other thing we had going on, Uranus was in Gemini making squares to that Saturn too. Well, we can stick with that because there's always that Uranus and Gemini thing, and we're going to start that here in the next few years too. But the other thing we had going on afterwards was, again, the rebuilding. The rebuilding had to change its labor force. And that's where I want to tie things into the present. We had to change the labor force. I talked about this already whenever it came to the nodes changing signs, that we were going to see a major shift in the rules, the policies, and specifically labor. This is the first round of that shift. And I talked about this back in January. Based off stagflation, we have to have the high versions of unemployment, because one of the things that I firmly saw with Neptune going into Aries was new industries. Now, some of you that have been struggling to find a job, one of the reasons why is because you're going to have to go start to work in a new industry, or the people that you know are going to have to start moving into a new industry because the old way of work, the old way of doing things is not going to continue. And a lot of this volatile energy that we have been in has been uprooting and forcing the change of, again, what's going to become our new normal. That new normal is not going to start to take shape again until the second part of 2025, specifically like May forward in a lot of ways, more so in 2026. These 2 years speak to a very big transition in industries, technology, growth potential. And I specifically want to go with now technology and AI. The first wave of Pluto and Aquarius corresponded with the first wave of AI coming live. One of the ways that we change something in regards to certain forms of labor, saying it that way, is going to be through the growth of technology. It is also how we got away from using slave labor back then. There had to be that first wave of change, of disruption, to lead for people to start looking at mechanics going back then, going back to the 1860s. The Industrial Revolution and mechanizing and building the mechanical things that led into the creation of things like the assembly line. We needed to crawl before we could walk. We needed to stop doing something the old way so we could start to develop and innovate and create. And one of the things that was very, very dominant through the last time Neptune was in Aries was inventions. Now, some inventions were cool and great, and they even impact us to this day. Others were stupid. I remember the first mousetrap invention that included a gun, like a Colt 44, to try to shoot a mouse. That happened then. But we had major revolutions and changes in the Reconstruction. We've had to have a shakeup for a new industry to start to take shape, for a new workforce to start to take shape. There are some jobs that no matter how we look at them, they're going to be done by computers. They're going to be taken over by AI. And that's not going to make a lot of people happy, but it's true. It's something that I've been seeing for a while. And so many people that, went into like tech jobs and computer jobs with the idea that it was going to be their long-term saving grace. Every few decades, we have a mentality that that's what happens. In the 50s and 60s, you had to get that labor job. And during that time, we were dominant with Neptune going through Virgo. You see one of the commonalities there. You went to go work for whatever assembly line, whatever labor job that was going to pay the bills forever. It was going to give you the most steady job until the 70s hit. And then suddenly there was this switch in the mentality. And as one industry started to grow, another one would fall back. And one of the ways that it would fall back would be to move the jobs to places that it didn't cost as much to build and create. That's one of the reasons why we struggled with so much in the 70s. Is sometimes you'd get one new industry that would come in and try to make it good, but another one would start to falter and fall back. We're seeing the faltering and the fallback right now. And people that have been in certain office jobs, in certain industries, for them to be able to do well, that industry is not going to continue. Because again, we're going into a new cycle and again, our new normal. That new normal is going to have challenges to it. It's going to have push. It's going to have growth. It's going to have change. And a lot of that is going to correspond with Neptune going into Aries. Now, I've got pros and cons to it, obviously. It's a very fueled belief system. Historically speaking, it didn't necessarily go well with the Civil War. What fell with the Civil War was with also the creation of the Ku Klux Klan. That all happened during Neptune and Aries. And I'm not sugarcoating that. I'm being realistic about the fact that some of the belief systems and the fueling around belief systems back then were not fun. And it seems like so much of our current policies are taking us back to an old mentality. I know that. I recognize that. and it's still not fun. But I'm always the devil's advocate, and I always try to see both sides, and I look at the positives. I feel like Neptune and Aries is going to force a whole new labor force. It's going to force a whole new reckoning of industry, because we got out of the habit many, many years ago. We got out of the habit as a collective of creating, of building, of doing things. But over the last decade, there's been an awakening that people realize they don't know what they need to know. And more people have spent time on YouTube gaining their education, going through trial and error, learning through TikTok. Now, that's been more recent, but still. YouTube University is a real thing, it seems like. We should be able to get a real degree that way, of learning in a whole different fashion. That learning in a whole different fashion is going to then also impact the education system. Because in some ways, certain parts of the colleges, I'm going to say it that way, universities, I'm not so much on the public school stuff, but I mean, there's pros and cons to it too. There is enough out there to show support that not everybody needs a 4-year degree. Some of us went to college and we don't even use the stuff that we learned in college. My best friend, we met in college and we were doing business studies together, economics classes together. He's an HVAC technician. He's a journeyman. I should say it that way. He's an HVAC journeyman now. And he does very well for himself. There is going to be a need and a push to go back more to an industry mindset. See, in the 80s, 90s, and even the early 2000s, the push was to go to white collar jobs because all of them were supposed to be 6-figure jobs. But what's happened over the course of the last 20 years is that they've not remained that way. And that type of mentality has not remained sustainable. So instead, what we're starting to see is the force of many, many people going into business for themselves, but usually they have to have a product. They have to have something that they're selling. They have to have some kind of knowledge base that's not necessarily open to every single person. They need a little bit of gumption. And I do attribute that the first round of that awakening through the 2010s, whenever Uranus was in Aries. Certain people had to be awakened to the fact that other industries need to be looked into. I think there's going to be a growth in the need for blue collar jobs, because the blue collar jobs have turned into the safe, sustainable, long-term 6-figure jobs. Now, one industry that I feel like is also going to have major growth in the next few years when Neptune goes into Aries is going to actually be medical, based off of new changes that are going to happen in this area. I am expecting advances in medicine and treatments once Neptune goes into Aries. I also feel like there's going to be some things that push for that to happen. Also, different conversation to be had. And I want to have it more once we're in the Neptune and Aries. Like, I want to feel it for a while before I really start talking about it more. So I'm more getting people mentally prepared because of historic factors that I have seen, and finding the correlations for a multitude of timelines as to like how we're seeing the same pattern now. Aries is the god of war. He's ruled by Mars. Mars, again, planet of war. But it's not just about war. It is about ambition. It is about a drive. It is about desire. And if I do one comparison to the 2010s, because we've all lived through the 2010s, is when Uranus was in Aries, the hustle mentality. That was so big in the 2010s. Everybody was in the hustle mentality. Hustle, hustle, hustle. We got to hustle. We got to hustle to make that money. We got to work, work, work. We're working 24/7. We're doing all the things that we need to do to grow and change and be better and do something different. I think there will be another form of the hustle mentality that's going to take shape whenever we get into these outer planets going into Aries, Saturn going into there, but also Neptune going into there. And I don't fully know how I feel yet about Saturn and Neptune's conjunction. And that actually doesn't go exact until the spring of 2026. And it's going to happen at 0 degrees of Aries. It's going to be the start of something. It's going to be that next wave of something that we're already dealing with based off of the great conjunction that started back in 2020. Now I'm referencing some stuff that I have talked about in prior episodes. I haven't had a whole lot of reason to talk about now, but again, intuition is taking over. Major changes in technology, in growth, industry growth. But I still think we're going to see the pattern of stagflation, where one industry will start to shift up, another one will have to shift down. Where one place will have growth, another one will have to shift down. And we're going to have growth in certain areas, but they will not be the areas that people would have initially anticipated. Because our mentality for the longest time was this whole other concept. And I think certain fields have gotten oversaturated and inflated. We got to drain other swamps besides just the government, using that term again. We have to drain some things out. We have to lance the wounds and let some of the energy come out, the pus come out, the infection come out, so we can try to re-regulate and we can try to make it heal. Whatever comes out has to go somewhere. Many of you have already been in the mentality of like, maybe I should go back to school. Maybe I should look at something different. Maybe I should go in this different direction. Maybe I should try something new. Maybe I should do something else. Maybe some of you are very steady in where you're at and you're just like, but I need to step it up a notch. Maybe I can try this to grow. Maybe I can try this to change. Maybe I can try this to do better or feel better or be more successful or make more money. And the whole energy is starting to push us into a new level, not necessarily a new kind, but a new level of hustle. For some people, it'll be a new kind because you're going to go into a whole different industry. For others, you're going to be growing what you've already built. And then again, I say a new level. There's a whole new vibration towards work and industry and jobs. And one of the things that people have said multiple times, there's multiple reports out there, I'm not going to just cite just one, is that certain industries, the top performing people in them are aging out. And if people don't start to go fill those jobs, and I'm talking about like carpenters and welders, I'm talking about the HVAC technicians, like my best friend, I'm talking about the electricians, I'm talking about people that have to get their freaking hands dirty. They don't get to wear a suit every day, but they got that $6-figure dollar. Those areas are about to boom. And if you're looking for a path, you're looking for a direction to go that's going to give you that comfort of the economics, you're going to have to transition. Many of you are going to fight me on this and be like, no, I'm fine. I'm fine. My job is fine. Everything I'm doing right here, it's going to be fine. Let's hope. But for a lot of people, and I've said a lot of this to certain people, especially like Gemini risings, Gemini and Aries risings, more so Gemini, I think, that a lot of them are going to be going into whole new industries, that trying to figure out where you're going to go in career and your direction and all that, that you're not even going to understand that because the industry that you're going to go into either doesn't exist yet, or the potential hasn't existed yet, or the mindset of what you need to do to get to that hasn't hit you yet to understand where you're going to go. And you might be wondering, like, Dusty, you've been going on Aries and Aries and Aries. Why would you suddenly say Gemini rising? Because the other thing that's going to happen later this year and going into 2026, and that's going to be the start of Uranus in Gemini. See, it's more than just one thing. I pay attention to all of it. We now understand Pluto and Aquarius. Like, we're in it now. We're dealing with it now. Fear in the masses, fear around technology. But whenever Uranus goes into Gemini, our mentality around said technologies is going to adapt and change, because Uranus is going to amplify that mercurial energy. It's also going to create some erratic mentality and erratic behavior. And my theory, this is my theory right now, is every time Uranus has been in Gemini, America goes to war. It's very well noted. The Revolutionary War, the Confederate War, World War II, all three of those, Uranus was in Gemini, and we're about to go into it again. And one of the things that I've noticed that I've never actually seen in the books being written is that when a planet is hosting another planet, that its energy is feeding into the host. But I've referenced it before. It's something that I've talked about personally. And I started talking about it whenever the South Node was hosting Venus. I'm like, the South Node hosting in Libra, Venus turning retrograde. This was the one back in 2023. It's like, this whole summer, it's going to be hyperized purge. If you're going to be seen, you do not want to be seen because you're going to be seen for the wrong reasons. The underbelly of the ego is going to come out. And it did. It was so strong during that time. Oh, whenever Mars went retrograde, hosting the North Node, I said that there would be martial gains, that even though that they were going to be disruptive, there were going to be gains. And for part of the Mars retrograde, people did have gains, especially Cancer risings. You guys had a lot of gains. Wasn't always the easiest, but you've had gains. And a lot of that's because during parts of that Mars retrograde, it was hosting the North Node. Now, with Mars being direct, it's hosting Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde. So this is why I had said before, like, this is the reactions to previous disruptions, but all of this is preparing us for those outer planets to go into Aries. But I also said that if we pay attention to each Mercury retrograde, which we're in the first one right now, while the South Node is in Virgo, we're going to see the upheaval. We're going to see the changes in rules, the changes in policies, all of these freaking executive orders, all of the unemployment rating, like jumping through the roof the way that it is, and all of these layoffs. It's going to lead to a change in how we are of service, how we care for things. It's going to have a change in labor. And it has resulted in exactly that. But we're still so new into this that we don't realize where we're going to have the unexpected change until we get into the latter parts of this year, whenever Uranus goes into Gemini. And that's going to start in July, but it's all like a pinky toe dip. He's going to come in July, stick his toe in the water, stay direct for 2 months, turn retrograde, and then go back after 2 more months retrograde in Gemini, go back into Taurus by November. So altogether, it's 4 months in Gemini. Then he's going to turn direct and come back. And in 2026, we're going to start the real full cycle of Uranus in Gemini. And that's going to lead to erratic changes in communication, in our mentality, in the logical mind, in what we see as logic and logistics, and what we see in communications. And it's going to really have a rampant uptick. But it's also going to correspond with those other outer planets that have changed. Pluto being in Aquarius, deeper by then. and the start, coexistent start of Neptune and Aries. There's so much change that's going to be coming after all of this retrograde mess. Just a mess. And I still say, once we get to April 13th, it's like we're going to wake up on April 13th and it is going to feel so surreal. And that's going to be the starting day of the new normal. We won't have a single planet retrograde. It's just going to be that first day. And then each day after that is us waking up in a new normal, trying to get an idea of how a new thing is going to go, how a new energy is going to build, what we're going to be focused on moving forward, where our direction is going to go. So all of the volatility is going to result in some level of change. I'm saying this in the collective energy as well as ourselves as individual. What you are dealing with in your personal life. It's going to have a change. I'm hopeful for the new normal. I have been hopeful. I've said it for so long. Just April 13th, it's D-Day. I'm not making a joke of like my name on that when I'm saying that, like, because some of you say, like, is that like the dusty date? Like, because that's what they call it. It's like, no, it's like, but it's the date that finally not a single freaking planet is retrograde. And we can wake up into something new, and we're going to be able to focus on new things and going into a different pattern and a different direction. And we will be building into something different from there. So I can be hopeful that all of these changes really do lead to new industries and new growth in businesses, technological industries that can be better for a lot of people. But for a lot of people to thrive, you're going to have to change with the energy. You have to figure out what your individual change is going to be. That's going to be different for everybody. But I hope this helps. I hope the history of tying some of those things together, and then this last little part where I'm just talking about the intuitive side, I hope all of this helps get an idea of like where we're going. I am hopeful. I've been hopeful. It's not just like recent energy. Like even before all of this like hit, I'm like, no, I'm still so hopeful for that after effect of where we land next. Because it feels, to me as an individual, it feels good. It feels right. It feels like we're going into something that's going to be magnanimous in so many ways. So I am hopeful. I'm not fearful. I'm just tired of the retrogrades. I'm ready to be on the other side. But I have been ready to be on that other side before this crap even started. So there's that. But in a lot of ways, I'm just shooting from the hip. But the whole idea, again, is to give you guys perspective of what I'm picking up on and my intuition and letting you in. Take what you can, listen to what you can, observe what you can, connect the dots yourself, deep dive into more of this and see what you find that I didn't find, because I'm not using AI. I should start at some point. I'm going to have to start. I know that. But I still do my research longhand. If I could have an encyclopedia set, that would be really great, because then I would trust a lot more. But my search histories look really weird. I'll say that. Anyways, now I'm just babbling. I love and appreciate every single one of you. I hope this helps. I hope this gives some peace of mind. I hope this gives you some ideas of confirmation as to what you're feeling. But bottom line, change is necessary. We are in a timeline of change to take us into our new normal. And the second half of this year and all of 2026 is us becoming accustomed to what that new normal is going to look like. Okay. I'll talk to everybody soon. Subscribe.